September 1968. A rebel leader was promised amnesty. He crossed the river believing the war was over, believing the handshake was real. They sat him down at a table lit by candlelight, poured him champagne, fed him caviar from silver dishes, smiled at him like brothers. Hours later, the man who had poured that champagne gave the order. His eyes were gouged out while he still breathed. His limbs were removed while he was still alive. This was not a mafia execution in some back alley. This was the head of state of a nation the size of Western Europe, and the victim was Pierre Mulele, a man who had trusted a promise of forgiveness. Glass clinked. Breath grew heavy. And then, beneath it all, a bass tone began to rise, slow, deliberate, the sound of a trap closing. His name was Joseph-Désiré Mobutu. The world would later know him as Mobutu Sese Seko, a name he gave himself, one that translated roughly to the warrior who, through endurance and an unshakable will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. He was the son of an army cook. He rose from a colonial backwater to become one of the wealthiest men on the planet, a man who turned the entire architecture of the Cold War into a personal weapon, who played the CIA and the Kremlin against each other like pieces on his own board, who stole an estimated $5 billion from a nation he claimed to be liberating. How does a cook's son end up dictating terms to the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth? How does he convert a jungle into a private kingdom of marble and gold while his own people starved in the dirt outside the palace gates? That question will not be answered yet. Hold on to it. The answer, and the ruins it left behind, are waiting at the end of this story. But here is a smaller question to carry first, one that will surface again and again over the next few minutes. Why would a simple, European-style suit, an ordinary necktie, an ordinary name, become a mortal threat to this man's grip on power? Why did silk and cotton terrify a dictator who controlled an army, a treasury, and a secret police network that could make anyone disappear? To understand Mobutu, you have to understand the moment he was born into. The Congo, freshly independent from Belgium, was a raw wound in 1960. Patrice Lumumba, the country's first elected prime minister, was a man of fire and conviction, and he was also, to Washington and Brussels, an unacceptable risk. Lumumba leaned toward Moscow rhetorically, even if his actual politics were more complicated than that label allowed. The West needed someone they believed they could control. They needed a loyal anti-communist proxy who would keep the Congo's vast mineral wealth, its cobalt, its copper, its uranium, flowing in the right direction. Mobutu, a young army colonel with sharp instincts and no fixed ideology beyond his own advancement, was exactly the kind of man the CIA thought it could own. They were wrong. Lumumba was betrayed, captured, and executed in 1961, with Mobutu's cooperation a central part of the machinery that made it happen. It was the first proof of what this man was capable of: charm a rival into trusting the wrong door, and then close it forever. By 1965, Mobutu had seized total power in a coup. The CIA had its man in the palace. What they did not yet understand was that their man had no intention of staying anyone's puppet. Over the following decades, Mobutu would extract enormous sums in military and economic aid from the United States by positioning himself as the indispensable bulwark against Soviet expansion in Central Africa, while simultaneously keeping channels open to other patrons, playing every side against every other side, bleeding resources from a superpower that believed it was buying loyalty and was actually buying its own manipulation. The puppet master found himself strangled by his own puppet. In 1971, Mobutu launched a campaign he called Authenticité, a return to authenticity, ostensibly a project of cultural decolonization. He renamed the country Zaire. He renamed himself. He renamed cities. And then he did something stranger and more revealing. He banned the necktie. He banned the Western suit entirely. In its place, every man in public life, every civil servant, every broadcaster, every diplomat was required to wear the abacost, a Mao-collared tunic whose name literally meant, "Down with the suit." On the surface, this looked like pride, like a nation reclaiming its own image from its colonizers. But look closer and you find something colder and more calculated. A suit is just fabric, until a dictator decides it represents an external loyalty, an allegiance to Europe, to the old colonial order, to anything other than him. By outlawing it, Mobutu was not liberating his people's fashion sense. He was erasing every visible alternative to his own authority. If everyone dresses according to your decree, everyone's body becomes a daily, walking advertisement for your power. That ordinary suit jacket, that ordinary tie, was dangerous to him precisely because it was a symbol he did not control. This was the deeper genius and horror of Mobutu's rule. He understood that political power alone was fragile, but mythological power was nearly unbreakable. He built himself into something closer to a god than a president. Every single evening, the national television broadcast opened with the same sequence. An image of Mobutu's face descending through clouds, literally framed as though he were lowering himself from the heavens to attend to his people. There was no subtlety in it, and there was no need for subtlety. Repetition is its own kind of hypnosis. Night after night, year after year, the Congolese people watched their leader emerge from the sky before the news of their own country began. He carried a carved ebony walking staff wherever he went, topped and wrapped with leopard skin patterning, and the leopard skin toque, the round pillbox hat he became globally recognized for, was not a fashion choice either. Leopards, in Congolese cultural symbolism, were associated with kingship, ferocity, and supernatural strength. He let rumors swirl. Some say he quietly encouraged them, that the staff itself was enchanted, that it carried weight beyond the physical, that on certain occasions it took several strong men to lift something that should have weighed almost nothing. Whether anyone truly believed the staff was magic is almost beside the point. What mattered was the effect. A population conditioned to see him not merely as a politician who could be voted out or overthrown by ordinary means, but as something touched by forces beyond politics entirely. Fear of a corrupt government can be organized against. Fear of a sorcerer king is harder to mobilize against because it operates beneath the rational mind. And underneath the mysticism, there was cold, structural calculation. Mobutu never let his own military become a single, unified threat to his throne. He deliberately fractured the armed forces into competing factions, rotated generals before any of them could build a loyal power base, starved certain units of resources while lavishing others, and made sure that ambitious men were too busy distrusting each other to ever conspire against him together. It was a chess master's move repeated for over 3 decades. Keep your most dangerous pieces fighting amongst themselves so none of them ever turns toward the king. While he preached authenticity, while he told his people to strip away every trace of European decadence, Mobutu was building the most extravagant monument to that very decadence the continent had ever seen. Deep in the rainforest, in his home village of Badalite, he constructed a palace complex so vast and so absurd that it earned the nickname Versailles of the jungle. Italian marble lined the floors. The walls were covered in materials flown in from Europe. There was a private airstrip built specifically to handle a Concorde, the supersonic jet, so that fresh pastries from Paris, French champagne and seafood could be flown directly into the heart of the Congolese rainforest before they had time to spoil. Picture it for a moment, viscerally. The suffocating, equatorial humidity of the jungle, the constant hum of insects, the dense green silence pressing in on every side, and then suddenly, tearing through all of it, the sonic boom of a Concorde breaking the air above the canopy, delivering salmon and champagne to a man surrounded by villagers who had no electricity and no clean water. Conveyor belts inside the palace moved dishes between kitchen and banquet hall. There was reportedly a bunker capable of withstanding a nuclear strike. This was not governance. This was theatre on a scale that bordered on delusion, a fortress built less to defend a nation and more to defend a myth. This is the moral knife edge this story keeps returning to, and it should make you uncomfortable. A man who told his citizens to reject foreign luxury as a betrayal of their roots was simultaneously importing French desserts by supersonic jet into a jungle clearing. A man who positioned himself as the spiritual father of his people allowed roads, hospitals, and schools across the country to collapse into ruin while diverting the nation's mineral wealth into Swiss bank accounts and European real estate. You are meant to feel two things at once watching this unfold: a grudging, uneasy admiration for the sheer audacity and strategic cunning of the man, and a rising disgust at exactly what that cunning was used to accomplish. Hold both of those feelings. Do not let either one cancel the other out. That tension is the truth of who he was. Let's walk through the timeline properly, because the speed at which this man operated is part of what makes the story so unsettling. In the first 3 years after independence, Mobutu moved from army chief of staff to the man who delivered Lumumba into the hands of his executioners, positioning himself as indispensable to Western interests while quietly building his own base of loyalty inside the military. By the mid-1960s, he had simply taken the presidency outright, no longer content to be a power behind a throne when he could sit on it himself. In the years that followed, roughly from the late 1960s through the mid-1970s, he constructed the architecture of his cult of personality. The nightly broadcasts from the clouds, the leopard skin toque, the ebony staff, the renaming of the country, the cities, himself, the banning of Western dress under authenticity. This was the period where Mobutu stopped being merely a president and started becoming something the population was conditioned to regard as semi-divine, untouchable, woven into the spiritual fabric of the nation, whether they wanted him there or not. This was also the era of consolidating brutal punishment for dissent, the Mulele execution being the most theatrical and grotesque public example, a warning broadcast through whispered horror to every potential rival watching from a safe distance. By the height of his power, through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the contradictions reached their most grotesque expression. Cobalt rose from the jungle floor. Concorde flights became almost routine. Billions of dollars, by most credible estimates, somewhere in the range of $5 billion over the course of his rule, flowed out of state coffers and into his personal fortune, even as the Congolese economy buckled under debt, inflation, and collapsing infrastructure. Rivals who got too close to real influence were ambushed, imprisoned, or executed, often after being lured in with exactly the kind of false reconciliation that destroyed Mulele years earlier. The pattern repeats throughout his rule: promise safety, offer comfort, then strike once the guard is down. And then the Cold War, the very engine that had made him useful, the very leverage that let him extract billions from Washington as the price of loyalty against Soviet influence, simply ended. The Berlin Wall fell. The strategic chessboard that had given Mobutu his value evaporated almost overnight. Without a Soviet threat to point to, without a rival superpower for the West to fear losing the Congo to, his usefulness collapsed. The aid dried up. The patience of his former allies dried up with it. Rebellion, long simmering under the surface of a population that had endured decades of plunder and fear, finally broke through. In 1997, after 32 years in power, Mobutu fled the country he had once renamed in his own image. He died in exile months later, far from the marble floors of Bardalit, far from the cameras that once filmed him descending through the clouds. Here is where the macro question from the beginning finally closes. How did a cook's son turn the Cold War into a personal weapon and steal billions while building a mythology of near-divine untouchability? He did it by understanding something most dictators never fully grasp, that raw force keeps a population obedient for a while, but it is psychological and symbolic control. The staff, the hat, the descending face on every broadcast, the band suit, the manufactured terror of betrayal that keeps a population obedient for decades. He turned two superpowers' paranoia into his personal income stream. He turned his own image into a substitute for state institutions. And when the external conditions that made him valuable disappeared, none of the mythology could save him, because mythology cannot pay an army, and it cannot feed a country that has been hollowed out for 30 years. Today, Gabardolite sits abandoned in the rainforest, slowly being reclaimed by exactly the wilderness it once tried to dominate. The Italian marble has cracked under tropical rain. Vines crawl up walls that once displayed imported European finishes. The swimming pools where champagne once flowed are filled now with stagnant water, with moss, with frogs croaking in the silence where a Concorde's engines once roared. The runway, built for supersonic jets, sits empty, swallowed at its edges by the same jungle it was carved out of. It is one of the most haunting images you will find anywhere in modern history. Absolute power, absolute extravagance, completely consumed by the patience of the natural world it once tried to subdue. Mobutu gave himself a name that meant a warrior who conquers and leaves fire in his wake. He got the fire. What he left behind in the end was ash, and a jungle slowly, silently, taking back everything he ever claimed for himself. That is the cost of building a kingdom on fear and myth instead of anything that could actually outlast you. Power borrowed from terror has an expiration date, even when it looks eternal from the inside. If this story of a man who turned superstition, superpowers, and sheer audacity into one of the most staggering personal fortunes in modern history left you with that same uneasy feeling, sit with it for a moment. Because the next chapter in this series goes even further, into a ruler whose grip on power makes Mobutu's empire of mirrors look almost restrained by comparison.